The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as 12-year-old Andrew made his way through Westside Park. The shortcut through the park saved him 15 minutes on his walk home from school, and on days like today, when homework piled high in his backpack, every minute counted. His mum would be working her second shift at the hospital tonight, which meant he needed to get home in time to start dinner for his younger sisters. Andrew adjusted his backpack straps and picked up his pace. The park was mostly empty on this Tuesday afternoon, with just a few dog walkers and an elderly couple sitting on a bench near the fountain. He liked this time of day in the park, peaceful with the golden light filtering through the oak trees that lined the main path. He was about halfway through the park when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong among the chirping birds and rustling leaves. A groan, followed by what sounded like someone catching their breath. Andrew slowed his steps, listening carefully. "Hello," he called out. "Is someone there?" No response came, but he heard another pained sound coming from near the fountain. Andrew hesitated for just a moment. His mom had always told him to be careful, especially around strangers. The world wasn't always kind to boys who looked like him. But something pulled him toward the sound. A feeling that someone needed help. As he approached a large stone fountain, he spotted her. A police officer was leaning heavily against the fountain's edge, one hand pressed against her very pregnant belly, the other gripping the stone so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her face was twisted in pain, beads of sweat forming on her forehead despite the cool October air. Andrew froze. His heart began to pound in his chest. Police made him nervous, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because his father had been taken away by officers 3 years ago on what his mother always called a mistake that the system won't fix. Since then, his mom had taught him to be respectful but cautious around law enforcement. But the officer didn't look threatening now. She looked scared. Her police radio lay on the ground a few feet away, likely dropped when she'd stumbled to the fountain for support. As Andrew watched, she tried to reach for it, only to double over in pain, a small cry escaping her lips. In that moment, the uniform disappeared, and all Andrew saw was a woman in trouble, a baby in trouble. "Officer?" "Are you okay?" he called, moving closer. She looked up, surprise flashing across her face before another wave of pain hit her. She gasped. "I need my radio." Andrew didn't hesitate this time. He dropped his backpack and rushed forward, scooping up the radio from where it had fallen. It was heavier than he expected, with buttons and dials he didn't understand. "How do I use it?" he asked, holding it out to her. The officer, Officer Mitchell, according to her nameplate, reached for the radio with a shaking hand, pressed the side button and... Another contraction cut her words short. She closed her eyes, breathing heavily through the pain. "Press the button and what?" Andrew asked, his voice rising with concern. When she didn't respond immediately, he looked down at the radio, found what he thought was the talk button, and pressed it. "Hello? Hello? There's a police officer who needs help at the park fountain. She's pregnant and in pain." His voice cracked with urgency. A crackling response came through almost immediately. "Who is this? What's your emergency?" "I'm Andrew. I'm at Westside Park by the big fountain. There's an officer here." He glanced at her nameplate again. "Officer Mitchell. She's pregnant and something's wrong. She needs help right away." "Copy that. Is Officer Mitchell conscious? Can she speak?" Andrew looked at the officer, whose eyes were now open but unfocused. "Yes, she's awake, but she's in a lot of pain. We're dispatching emergency services now. ETA 4 minutes. Stay with her. Keep her talking if possible." "Okay, I will." Officer Mitchell's breathing had become more labored. "Thank you," she managed to say. "What's your name?" "I'm Andrew. I was just walking home from school." He knelt beside her, unsure what else to do. The dispatcher said help is coming in 4 minutes. She nodded, then grimaced again. "My baby, it's too early." Andrew felt a spike of fear but tried to stay calm. "My mom works in the maternity ward at Memorial Hospital. She says babies come when they want to, and the doctors know what to do either way." A small smile flickered across the officer's face before fading back into a wince. "Smart mom." "She is. She's working a double shift today." Andrew surprised himself by continuing to talk, the words spilling out to fill the scary silence. "I'm supposed to make dinner for my sisters. Spaghetti tonight. It's the only thing I know how to cook that they'll both eat without complaining. Officer Mitchell's eyes started to close, her head drooping slightly. Hey, stay awake, Andrew said, alarmed. Tell me about your baby. Is it a boy or a girl? Girl, the officer whispered. My husband wants to name her after his grandmother, but the name is so old-fashioned. Her voice was getting weaker. Andrew looked around frantically. Where was that ambulance? He spotted a couple walking on a path about 50 yards away. Hey, he shouted, waving his arms. Help! We need help over here. The couple looked over, startled, then began jogging toward them when they realized something was wrong. Officer, help is coming, Andrew reassured her. Just a little longer. But Officer Mitchell had gone completely pale, her eyes fluttering closed as she slumped further against the fountain. Andrew caught her shoulders before she could hit the ground, gently guiding her to lie on the park grass. The movement caused her utility belt to shift, and something fell from one of the pouches. A folded emergency blanket in silver packaging. Andrew quickly opened it and placed it over her, remembering how his mom had once told him that keeping someone warm was important when they were in shock. Then he took off his jacket, rolled it up, and carefully placed it under her head. The couple reached them just as distant sirens became audible. What happened? The woman asked, already pulling out her phone. She's a police officer and she's pregnant, Andrew explained. I called for help on her radio. An ambulance is coming. You did the right thing, son, the man said, kneeling to check Officer Mitchell's pulse. I'm a retired nurse. Her pulse is rapid but strong. The woman was already on her phone with 911, confirming their exact location. Andrew stood back, suddenly feeling very young and very scared. What if the baby didn't make it? What if the officer didn't make it? The sirens grew louder, and soon flashing lights appeared at the park entrance. Andrew ran toward the path, waving his arms to guide the paramedics to their location. Everything happened quickly after that, the paramedics rushing in with equipment, checking Officer Mitchell's vitals, starting an IV, and carefully loading her onto a stretcher. BP's dropping, one of them said. We need to move. Another paramedic looked at Andrew. You the one who called this in? Andrew nodded. You did good, kid, real good. You want to ride along to the hospital? Andrew thought about his sisters, who would be getting off the school bus soon, expecting him to be home. I can't. My sisters will be home alone. The paramedic nodded understandingly. Give me your name and number. The officer's family might want to thank you. Andrew hesitated, then provided his information. As the ambulance prepared to leave, he stepped forward. Will she be okay? And her baby? The paramedic's face softened. She's in good hands now, thanks to you. Memorial has one of the best maternal units in the state. As the ambulance pulled away, sirens blaring, Andrew stood watching until it disappeared from view. The retired nurse placed a hand on his shoulder. That was a brave thing you did today, he said. Andrew picked up his backpack, suddenly remembering his sisters and dinner and homework. I just did what anyone would do, he replied, though he wasn't sure that was true. Not everyone, the man's wife said quietly. Not everyone would stop to help. Andrew thanked them and hurried home, his mind racing. He'd need to tell his mom what happened when she called to check in during her break. What would she say? Would she be proud of him for helping or upset that he put himself in a potentially dangerous situation? By the time he reached his apartment building, he'd decided that no matter what, he'd made the right choice. The officer needed help, and he was there to give it. It was as simple as that. As he unlocked the door to the empty apartment, he couldn't stop thinking about Officer Mitchell and her baby. He hoped they were okay. He hoped the ambulance had gotten to the hospital in time. Little did he know that this chance encounter in the park would change not just Officer Mitchell's life, but his own family's future in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning, Andrew couldn't focus on his pre-algebra test. His pencil hovered over the paper as his mind replayed yesterday's events in the park. He had barely slept, wondering about Officer Mitchell and her baby. His mom had been shocked when he told her what happened during their nightly phone call. You did what? She had exclaimed, the hospital sounds buzzing in the background. I helped a police officer, Mom. She was pregnant and in trouble. There had been a long pause before his mother spoke again, her voice softer. Are you okay? I'm fine. Just worried about her. His mother had sighed. That's my boy. Always thinking of others. Then, her voice taking on a more serious tone, but Andra, you know how I feel about me getting involved with the police. I know, Mom. But she needed help. She was a person first, an officer second. Now, staring at problem number 7 on his test, Andrew couldn't remember the formula for solving proportions. Ms. Winters walked by his desk and paused, noticing his blank paper. 10 minutes left, Andrew, she whispered. He nodded and forced himself to focus. By the time the bell rang, he had answered most questions, though he wasn't confident about his work. As students filed out, Ms. Winters called him to her desk. Everything okay? You seem distracted today. Andrew hesitated. Something happened yesterday, and I can't stop thinking about it. Before he could explain, the classroom door opened. Vice Principal Harden stood there with a tall man in a police uniform. Andrew's heart jumped to his throat. Andrew Thompson? The officer asked, his face serious. Andrew nodded, suddenly feeling like his legs were made of jelly. I'm Lieutenant Wilson, Officer Mitchell's supervisor. His stern expression softened slightly. I'd like to speak with you about what happened yesterday. Ms. Winters looked between them, confused. Andrew, is everything all right? He's not in trouble, Lieutenant Wilson assured her. Quite the opposite. 10 minutes later, Andrew sat in the guidance counselor's office with Lieutenant Wilson and Vice Principal Harden. The lieutenant had explained that Officer Mitchell had undergone emergency surgery but was now stable. The baby, a little girl, had been delivered prematurely but was doing well in the night here. The doctor said if she had been alone in that park for even 10 more minutes, we might have lost both of them, Lieutenant Wilson said, his voice thick with emotion. Your quick thinking saved 2 lives yesterday. Andrew stared at his hands. I just did what anyone would do. No, the lieutenant said firmly. Not everyone would have stopped to help a police officer in this neighborhood. Not with the history between the department and the community. We know that. Andrew looked up, surprised by the acknowledgement. Officer Mitchell's husband asked me to bring you this. The lieutenant handed Andrew an envelope. It's a thank you note and a visitor's pass for the hospital if you and your family would like to visit. Andrew took the envelope, unsure what to say. You don't have to decide now, Lieutenant Wilson added. But Officer Mitchell would like to thank you in person when she's feeling better. After school, Andrew walked home slowly, the envelope heavy in his pocket. His sisters chatted beside him, excited about their day, but his mind was elsewhere. When they reached their apartment, he was surprised to see his mother's shoes by the door. Mom? You're home early? Letitia Thompson emerged from the kitchen, dark circles under her eyes betraying her exhaustion after a double shift. I switched with another nurse so I could be home. She pulled him into a tight hug. My hero, son. Andrew squirmed out of her embrace, embarrassed. Mom, I'm not a hero. The hospital is buzzing about what you did. The pregnant officer you helped. She's the wife of Dr. Mitchell, one of our attending physicians in the ER. Andrew's eyes widened. Really? His mother nodded. Small world. Now every doctor and nurse in that place is talking about how Letitia Thompson's son saved Dr. Mitchell's wife and baby. She smiled, but there was worry behind her eyes. The police came to the school. Andrew showed her the envelope. Her supervisor brought this. They want us to visit the hospital. His mother took the envelope but didn't open it. What do you want to do? Andrew thought for a moment. I want to know if they're okay. His mother nodded slowly. Then we'll go. Saturday morning, after my shift ends. Saturday came quickly. Andrew spent the morning helping his sisters with their weekend chores while their mother slept after her night shift. By noon, they were all dressed in their best clothes, the ones usually reserved for church, and heading to Memorial Hospital. Andrew had been to the hospital before to pick up his mom, but never as a visitor. The main lobby was busy with people coming and going, their faces telling different stories of worry, relief, or grief. At the information desk, his mother showed the visitor's pass, and they were directed to the maternity floor. As they stepped off the elevator, Andrew was surprised to see several police officers in the waiting area. One of them looked up and recognized him immediately. That's him, the officer said to his colleagues. That's the kid. Andrew froze as 5 officers turned to look at him. His youngest sister, Zoe, grabbed his hand tightly. A female officer approached them, smiling. "You must be Andra." "I'm Officer Parker. I work with Officer Mitchell." She extended her hand. "Thank you for what you did." One by one, the officers came to shake his hand. Andra stood stunned as they expressed their gratitude, unable to reconcile these friendly faces with the fear his family had carried for years. A doctor in blue scrubs appeared in the hallway. "Are you the Thompson family?" When they nodded, he smiled broadly. "I'm Dr. Mitchell. My wife and daughter are eager to meet you." He led them to a private room where Officer Mitchell was sitting up in bed, looking pale but alert. A nurse stood nearby, adjusting something on a monitor. When Officer Mitchell saw Andra, her eyes filled with tears. "There he is," she said softly, "my guardian angel." Andra felt his face grow hot with embarrassment. "I'm not an angel. I just helped." "You did more than help," she insisted. "You saved us." She gestured to a chair near the bed. "Please, sit. Tell me what happened after I passed out. It's all fuzzy in my mind." Andra sat cautiously, aware of everyone watching him. He recounted the events in the park as best he could remember, the radio call, the couple who helped, the paramedics who came. When he finished, Officer Mitchell reached for his hand. "The doctors told me I had a placental abruption. It's when the placenta separates from the uterus before birth. It can be." She glanced at Andra's younger sisters and chose her words carefully. "It can be very dangerous. If you hadn't found me when you did, if you hadn't called for help so quickly." Dr. Mitchell placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "We have a healthy baby girl because of you. Do you want to see her?" Andra looked at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. They'd followed Dr. Mitchell to the NICU, where, after washing their hands thoroughly and putting on special gowns, they were led to a small incubator. Inside lay a tiny baby, smaller than any Andra had ever seen, with tubes and wires connecting her to various machines. "This is Hope," Dr. Mitchell said proudly. 5 pounds, 2 ounces. Small, but mighty. Andra stared at the baby in wonder. "I helped save her." "You absolutely did," the doctor confirmed. Later, as they prepared to leave, Officer Mitchell asked to speak with Andra and his mother privately. The others stepped out, leaving the three of them alone in her hospital room. "I understand your father is Michael Thompson," Officer Mitchell said quietly. Andra felt his body tense. How did she know about his dad? His mother's voice was guarded when she replied, "Yes, he's been incarcerated for 3 years." Officer Mitchell nodded. "Dr. Mitchell told me." "The nurses talk." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I know relations between the police and the community haven't always been fair, especially for families like yours." Andrew's mother said nothing, her expression unreadable. "I want you to know that I don't take lightly what Andrew did for me. He had every reason to walk away when he saw my uniform, but he didn't." Officer Mitchell's voice grew stronger. "That kind of character, that kind of humanity, it deserves to be recognized and repaid." "We don't need payment," Letitia said firmly. "Not payment," Officer Mitchell clarified. "Justice. Your son showed me compassion without hesitation. The least I can do is look into your husband's case with the same open mind." Andrew looked at his mother, whose eyes had widened in surprise. "What are you saying?" Letitia asked. "I'm saying that I have connections in the department. I can look at the case files, see if there were any procedural issues. I can't promise anything, but..." She reached for Letitia's hand. "Let me try, please, for Andra, for what he did for my family." The room fell silent. Andra held his breath, watching his mother's face as she processed this unexpected offer. "Why would you do this?" Letitia finally asked. "You don't even know us." Officer Mitchell smiled softly. "Because your son didn't know me either. But he still chose to help." She looked at Andra. "Sometimes one act of kindness is all it takes to start changing things for the better." As they left the hospital, Andra walked slightly ahead of his mother and sisters, his mind racing with new possibilities. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. Just like the tiny baby in the NICU, small but fighting, hope was now growing inside him. Little did he know that this was just the beginning of a journey that would transform not just his family, but an entire community. 2 weeks passed since the hospital visit. Life returned to its normal rhythm for the Thompson family, Letitia working long shifts at the hospital, Andrew looking after his sisters, and everyone trying not to get their hopes up about Officer Mitchell's offer to look into their father's case. "Don't count on anything," Letitia told Andrew as she got ready for work one evening. "People make promises when they're grateful, but real life has a way of making them forget." Andrew nodded, but he couldn't help thinking about the sincerity in Officer Mitchell's eyes. It hadn't seemed like an empty promise. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the call came. Andrew was helping Zoe with her spelling homework when his mother's phone rang. She answered it in the kitchen, her voice too low for him to hear the conversation. When she returned to the living room 5 minutes later, her expression was unreadable. "That was Officer Mitchell," she said, sitting heavily on the couch. "She wants to meet with us this weekend. She says she found something in your father's case." Andrew's heart leaped. Something good. His mother shook her head. She wouldn't say over the phone, just that it's important we meet in person. That Saturday, they met Officer Mitchell at a small cafe 3 blocks from their apartment. She was out of uniform, dressed in jeans and a loose sweater that concealed most of her still recovering figure. Without the uniform, she looked different, more approachable, less intimidating. Her husband was with her, carrying a baby car seat covered with a light blanket. After exchanging greetings, they settled at a corner table. Dr. Mitchell carefully placed the car seat on a chair and pulled back the blanket, revealing the tiny sleeping baby. "Baby Hope is doing really well," he said proudly. "She's gaining weight right on schedule." Letitia smiled politely, but Andrew could tell she was anxious to hear about his father. Officer Mitchell seemed to sense this too. "Thank you for meeting us," she began, her voice low. "I know you must be wondering what I found." She pulled a folder from her bag and placed it on the table. "I spent the last 2 weeks reviewing your husband's case files, and I also spoke with some colleagues in narcotics." She opened the folder and turned it so Letitia could see. The arrest happened during a larger operation targeting drug dealers in the West Side area. Your husband was picked up with several others when officers raided an apartment building. Letitia nodded stiffly. "We know all this. What you might not know," Officer Mitchell continued, "is that your husband was originally classified as a low-level person of interest, basically, someone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But somewhere between the arrest and the charging, his status changed to known associate of the main dealer." "That's not true," Letitia said, her voice tight with emotion. "Michael wasn't involved with those people. He was there to fix the building's heating system. He's an HVAC technician." Officer Mitchell nodded. "That's exactly what I found out. There was a work order signed by the building manager confirming your husband was there on a legitimate job." She pulled out another document. "This work order was in the evidence files, but it was never presented during the preliminary hearing." Andrew watched his mother's hands begin to tremble. "Why not?" "That's what I asked. According to the notes, the detective in charge didn't consider it relevant since your husband was found in an apartment where drugs were present, not in the boiler room." Officer Mitchell's expression hardened slightly. "But there's more. The person who identified your husband as an associate was a confidential informant who was trying to reduce his own sentence by naming others." Dr. Mitchell spoke up. The prosecution's case relied heavily on this informant's testimony, but the defense was never given his identity to cross-examine him. That's a Brady violation. The prosecution is required to disclose evidence that might help the defense. Letitia stared at them both. "Are you saying Michael's conviction could be overturned?" "It's possible," Officer Mitchell said cautiously. "I've spoken with a friend at the public defender's office. She believes there are grounds for an appeal based on the withheld evidence and the Brady violation." Andrew could hardly breathe. For 3 years, they had lived without his father, believing the system was too powerful to fight. Now suddenly, there was a chance. A real chance he might come home. "Why are you doing this?" Letitia asked, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't know us. You don't know Michael." Officer Mitchell reached across the table, not quite touching Letitia's hand but close. "Because your son taught me something important that day in the park. He didn't see a uniform. He saw a person who needed help. I'm trying to do the same thing. See the person, not just the case number." Dr. Mitchell added, "And because we believe in justice, real justice, not just convictions." The meeting lasted another hour as they discussed next steps. The Mitchells had already arranged for Letitia to meet with a lawyer who specialized in wrongful convictions. The lawyer had agreed to take the case pro bono, free of charge. As they prepared to leave, Officer Mitchell handed Letitia a business card. "This is my personal number. Call me anytime, day or night, if you have questions or concerns." Walking home, Andrew noticed his mother was quieter than usual, lost in thought. "Do you think Dad will really come home?" he finally asked. She squeezed his shoulder. "I don't know, baby. But for the first time in 3 years, I think we have a fighting chance." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Letitia met with the lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Ms. Rodriguez, who listened carefully to their story and reviewed the evidence Officer Mitchell had uncovered. "This is compelling," Ms. Rodriguez said after examining the documents. "The withheld work order alone is significant, but the Brady violation regarding the informant could be grounds for immediate relief." Andrew didn't understand all the legal terms, but he understood the growing optimism in his mother's eyes. There were more meetings, with lawyers, with Officer Mitchell, and finally a hearing date was set. 3 months after the date in the park, Andrew sat in a courtroom wearing his church suit, watching as Ms. Rodriguez argued passionately for his father's conviction to be vacated. The prosecutor, a stern-faced woman, didn't contest the motion. In light of the new evidence brought forward by Officer Mitchell, and upon review of the case file, the state acknowledges the procedural errors that occurred and does not oppose the defense's motion. The judge, an older man with thick glasses, reviewed the documents before him. Based on the evidence presented and the state's position, this court finds that Michael Thompson's Sixth Amendment rights were violated during his prosecution. The conviction is hereby vacated. He looked directly at Andrew's father, who sat at the defense table in his prison uniform. "Mr. Thompson, you are to be released immediately pending the state's decision on whether to retry this case." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Andrew felt his mother's hand grip his tightly, her body shaking with silent sobs. He looked over at Officer Mitchell, who sat several rows behind them. She gave him a small smile and a nod. 2 hours later, they stood outside the courthouse steps waiting. Officer Mitchell and Dr. Mitchell waited with them, little Hope sleeping peacefully in her carrier. "I still can't believe this is happening," Letitia whispered. 3 years of fighting the system, getting nowhere. Then Andrew helps you in the park, and suddenly everything changes. Officer Mitchell adjusted the blanket over her daughter. "Sometimes the system works exactly as it should, but sometimes it needs a push from people who care enough to look deeper." The doors of the courthouse opened, and a man in ill-fitting civilian clothes stepped out, squinting in the bright sunlight. For a moment, Andrew didn't recognize him. His father had lost weight, and his hair had more gray than he remembered. But then those familiar eyes found him in the crowd, and Andrew was running, launching himself into his father's arms. "Dad, Dad!" Michael Thompson caught his son, holding him so tight Andrew could barely breathe. Then Letitia was there too, and Zoe and Kayla, all of them clinging to each other on the courthouse steps, oblivious to the passers-by who smiled at their reunion. When they'd finally pulled apart, Michael noticed the Mitchells standing nearby. "You must be the officer my son helped," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Officer Mitchell nodded, stepping forward. "And you must be the father he's been missing." Michael looked between the officer and his family, confusion evident on his face. "I don't understand. How did this happen?" "It's a long story," Letitia said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "But it started with Andrew doing what you always taught him, helping someone in need, no matter who they are." Officer Mitchell held out her hand. "Your son saved my life and my daughter's life. Helping to right this wrong was the least I could do." Michael shook her hand, still looking bewildered. "Thank you. I don't know what else to say." "You don't need to say anything," Dr. Mitchell replied. "Just go home with your family. That's all the thanks we need." As they walked away from the courthouse, Andrew couldn't stop looking at his father, memorizing his face, his walk, the sound of his laugh. It still didn't seem real that he was here, that they were going home together. "So," his father said, arm around Letitia's shoulders, "I hear you're making spaghetti for dinner these days." Andrew grinned. "Yeah, but I bet you can make it better." "I don't know," Michael teased. 3 years is a long time to be out of the kitchen. I might be rusty." Letitia leaned into her husband's side. You've got plenty of time to practice now." As they reached their street, Andrew glanced back. The Mitchells were still standing near their car, watching the family walk away. Officer Mitchell raised her hand in a small wave, which Andrew returned. In that moment, he realized something important. The world wasn't divided into neat categories of good people and bad people. Sometimes, a single act of kindness could bridge the deepest divides, creating connections where none seemed possible before. His father was coming home, and somehow, against all odds, a pregnant police officer in distress had been the key to making it happen. The weeks following Michael Thompson's release were both wonderful and strange. After 3 years of absence, having him back home created a joy that bubbled through their small apartment, but also required adjustments as everyone learned how to be a family again. Andrew watched his father relearn the rhythms of normal life. He noticed how Dad would sometimes stand in the middle of a room, momentarily lost, as if forgetting where he was heading, or how he'd wake before dawn, unable to shake the prison schedule from his body. But he also saw his father's determined efforts to rebuild, applying for jobs, helping with homework, and fixing things around the apartment that had been broken for years. "It's like having a handyman who never leaves," his mother joked one evening after Michael repaired both the leaky kitchen faucet and the temperamental toaster in a single afternoon. But finding a job proved difficult. Every application required checking the box for prior convictions, and although his record was now cleared, the gap in his employment history raised questions. "They don't say it's because of prison," Michael explained to Andrew after another failed interview, "but I see it in their eyes when I try to explain where I've been for 3 years." Their savings were dwindling, and Letitia was picking up extra shifts at the hospital to compensate. The joy of reunion had begun to mix with the harsh realities of life after incarceration. One Saturday morning, a knock on their door surprised them. Andrew opened it to find Officer Mitchell standing there with baby Hope in a carrier. The baby had grown noticeably in the month since they'd last seen her. "Good morning," Officer Mitchell said with a smile. "Sorry to drop by unannounced. Is your family home?" Andrew nodded and invited her in, curious about her unexpected visit. His parents emerged from the kitchen, his mother wiping her hands on a dishcloth. Officer Mitchell, his father said, his voice carefully neutral. Despite everything she had done for their family, Andrew knew his father still felt uncomfortable around police. "Please call me Lynn," she insisted, setting the baby carrier down. "I'm not here officially, just as a friend." Andrew's mother offered her coffee, which she accepted gratefully. Once they were all seated in the living room, Lynn explained her visit. "My husband was talking with the hospital maintenance supervisor yesterday. Apparently, they're desperately short-staffed in the HVAC department, especially with summer coming. 2 technicians quit last month." She looked directly at Michael. "When David, my husband, mentioned he knew an experienced HVAC technician looking for work, the supervisor practically begged for your contact information." Michael straightened in his chair. "Are you serious?" Lynn nodded. "The supervisor's name is Tony Reyes. He said you can come in Monday morning for what he called a formality interview. From what David told me, they're ready to hire you on the spot." Andrew watched his father's face transform, hope breaking through like sunshine after a storm. "I don't know what to say," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to say anything," Lynn replied. "Just be there Monday at 8 a.m. Tony knows about your situation. He has a brother who went through something similar." Letitia reached for her husband's hand. "This could change everything for us." "There's something else," Lynn added, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a folder and handed it to Michael. "The lawyer who worked on your case, Ms. Rodriguez, asked me to give you this. It's information about filing for compensation from the state for wrongful incarceration. It's not a guarantee, but given the clear evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, she thinks you have a strong case." Michael took the folder with trembling hands. "Why are you doing all this for us?" Lynn glanced at Andrew before answering. "When your son found me in that park, he didn't hesitate to help a stranger, a police officer, no less, despite having every reason to walk away. That kind of character doesn't come from nowhere." She looked back at Michael. "It comes from good parents who teach their children to do the right thing, even when it's hard." She brushed a strand of hair from her face, suddenly seeming a bit self-conscious. "Besides, working on your case opened my eyes to problems in our system. problems I was part of, even if unintentionally. She paused. I think I needed this as much as your family did. Before they could respond, baby Hope began to fuss. Lynn lifted her from the carrier, and Andrew's sisters immediately crowded around to see the baby. She's so much bigger now, Zoe exclaimed. Babies grow fast, Lynn said with a smile. She's almost at her actual birth weight now. As the conversation shifted to babies and children, Andrew noticed his parents exchange a look, one of those adult glances filled with unspoken meaning. His mother's eyes were shining with unshed tears, but they weren't sad tears. They were the kind that came from Hope returning after a long absence. Monday morning, Andrew woke early to wish his father good luck before school. Michael stood in the kitchen, wearing his one good shirt, freshly ironed, and the tie Andrew's mother had bought him yesterday. You look like a boss, Andrew told him, grabbing a piece of toast. His father laughed nervously. I feel like I'm going to throw up. You'll be great, Letitia assured him, straightening his tie for the third time. Just be yourself. Michael kissed her cheek. The best version of myself, right? When Andrew returned from school that afternoon, the apartment was quiet. He found his mother at the kitchen table, staring at her coffee cup. Mom, where's Dad? Did the interview? She looked up, and Andrew was startled to see tears streaming down her face. Mom, what happened? Did something go wrong? A knot of dread formed in his stomach. But then she smiled through her tears, shaking her head. No, baby. Everything went right. Your dad got the job. He starts tomorrow. Then why are you crying? She wiped her eyes. Because he called me from the hospital to tell me, and then he stayed to fill out all the paperwork. And then the supervisor gave him a tour of the whole facility. And then she took a deep breath. And then they had him fix an air handler that was giving them trouble just to see what he could do. And baby, when your father called me after that, he sounded like himself again. Like the man I married before all this happened. Anda sat beside her, relief washing over him. So these are happy tears? She nodded, reaching out to squeeze his hand. The supervisor said your dad diagnosed and fixed in 30 minutes what their contractor couldn't figure out in 3 days. He said they're lucky to have him. Anda grinned. Dad always said he could fix anything with moving parts. His mother laughed softly. That he did. She grew more serious. He told me something else too. Said that walking through that hospital, knowing he was going to be working in the same building where Officer Mitchell's husband works, where I work, it felt like coming full circle. Like everything that happened was leading to this moment. Later that evening, the family celebrated with a special dinner. Michael had stopped at the grocery store on his way home and bought ingredients for his famous chili, a meal they hadn't enjoyed since before his arrest. As they ate, he shared details about his new job. The hours, the benefits that would start after 90 days, the team he'd be working with. For the first time in years, they talked about the future as something bright and promising, not something to dread. I'm thinking, Michael said as they finished dinner, that maybe when I get my first real paycheck, we should invite the Mitchells over for dinner, to thank them properly. Letitia nodded. That's a wonderful idea. Anda helped clear the dishes, listening as his parents discussed what they might cook and when would be a good time. It still amazed him how much had changed because of one moment in the park, one decision to help, one connection made between people who might never have met otherwise. 2 weeks later, the Mitchells arrived for dinner. Dr. Mitchell, David, as he insisted they call him, brought a bottle of sparkling cider, and Lynn carried baby Hope, who was now alert and curious about everything around her. The apartment felt crowded with 7 people, but in the best possible way. The adults talked easily about work, the children played together, and Andrew found himself watching it all with a sense of wonder. Here was his father, laughing and sharing stories with a doctor and a police officer, people who would have seen from another world just months ago. During a quiet moment, Lynn pulled Andrew aside. I have something to tell you, she said, her voice low. After what happened with your father's case, I started looking into other arrests from that same operation. There were irregularities in some of those cases too. Andrew's eyes widened. You mean other innocent people might be in prison? She nodded grimly. I've been working with Ms. Rodriguez to review the evidence. 3 cases so far have been flagged for potential wrongful convictions. What are you going to do? The right thing, she said simply. even if it makes some people in the department uncomfortable. She glanced toward the living room, where their families were laughing together. Your courage that day in the park inspired me to find my own. After dinner, as everyone gathered in the living room for dessert, Michael cleared his throat. I want to make a toast, he said, raising his glass of cider. To new beginnings, to justice that's late but not denied, and most importantly, he looked at Andra, to a son who taught us all what real courage looks like. Everyone raised their glasses. Andra felt his face grow hot with embarrassment, but also with pride. And to connections, Lynn added, that remind us we're all human first, before any other label we might wear. As the evening wound down and the Mitchells prepared to leave, David handed Michael a business card. A buddy of mine works for the Housing Authority. They're developing a new apartment complex with affordable units for families. He said to give you a call if you're interested. Michael took the card, surprised. We've been wanting to move for years, but with my record. That's not an issue anymore, David assured him. And they give preference to essential workers, which now includes you. On the doorstep, as final goodbyes were exchanged, Lynn hugged Andra. Sometimes the smallest actions change everything, she whispered. Never forget that. After they left, Andra stood at the window, watching the Mitchells drive away. Behind him, he could hear his parents talking excitedly about the possibility of a new apartment, a fresh start. He thought about what Lynn had said about looking into other cases, about doing the right thing even when it was difficult. One moment in the park had created ripples that were still spreading outward, touching lives he didn't even know. And somehow, he had been the one to cast the first stone into the water. His father joined him at the window, placing a hand on his shoulder. Penny for your thoughts. Andra smiled up at him. Just thinking about how glad I am that I took the shortcut through the park that day. His father squeezed his shoulder. Me too, son, me too. 6 months passed. Spring blossomed into summer, and summer faded into fall. The Thompson family's life had transformed in ways they could hardly have imagined that fateful day in the park. Michael had not only kept his job at the hospital, but had been promoted to lead maintenance technician after just 4 months. His supervisors praised his work ethic and problem-solving skills, and he had become something of a legend among the staff for fixing equipment that others had given up on. It's like having a magician on the payroll. One doctor had commented after Michael restored an expensive imaging machine that the manufacturer had declared beyond repair. With Michael's steady income and Letitia able to reduce her hours to a normal schedule, the family's financial situation had stabilized. But the biggest change came in August, when they moved out of their cramped apartment into a 3-bedroom unit in the new Riverbend housing development, the same one Dr. Mitchell's friend had mentioned. Andra now had his own room for the first time in his life. No more sharing with his sisters, no more doing homework at the kitchen table because there was nowhere else quiet enough to concentrate. The new place had a small yard, security at the entrance, and best of all, was in a better school district. On a crisp October Saturday, Andra stood in his new bedroom, pinning up a science fair certificate he'd just received. His walls were slowly filling with achievements, academic awards, a certificate from a summer coding camp the hospital had sponsored, and a special commendation from the mayor for his extraordinary act of citizenship in helping Officer Mitchell. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." His father entered, holding a small wrapped package. "Got a minute?" Andra nodded, curious about the package. "This came in the mail today," Michael said, handing it to Andra. "It's from Officer Mitchell, Lynn." Andra unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a framed photograph of baby Hope, now nearly 8 months old, sitting up and grinning toothlessly at the camera. A note was attached. "To my hero on his birthday. You saved one life directly and many more through your example. Thank you. Lynn, David, and Hope." Andra stared at the photo, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. Tomorrow was his 13th birthday, and though he knew his parents had planned a small party, this unexpected gift touched him deeply. "There's something else," his father said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Lynn called earlier. She wanted to know if we'd be interested in being part of something she's organizing." "What kind of something?" Michael's expression grew serious but excited. "A community initiative. She's been working on it for months, ever since she started investigating those other cases from the drug operation." Andra sat beside his father. In the months since their dinner together, Lynn had successfully helped 2 more men overturn wrongful convictions related to the same police operation that had imprisoned his father. The story had made local news, causing both praise and tension within the police department. "She's calling it Bridge the Gap," Michael continued. "It's a program to bring police officers and community members together, especially youth and families who've been affected by the justice system. What would we do? Share our story for one thing. Participate in discussion groups. Help rebuild trust between the police and the community." Michael paused. "Lynn thinks our family's experience could be powerful, how one moment of kindness in the park created a connection that led to justice and reconciliation." Ander thought about this. A year ago, if someone had suggested he'd be working with police on anything, he would have laughed in disbelief. His family had viewed police as a threat, not allies. But his perspective had changed, becoming more nuanced. He now understood that systems could be flawed without everyone in them being corrupt. "What do you think?" he asked his father. "Do you want to do it?" Michael was quiet for a moment. "I spent 3 years in prison for something I didn't do. That kind of experience, it changes a man." He looked directly at Andra. "I could stay angry. Some days I still am angry. But then I look at what's come from all this, our new home, my job, the compensation we received." The state had awarded Michael a substantial settlement for his wrongful incarceration, money they had used to pay off debts and start a college fund for the children. "Most importantly," Michael continued, "I think about how Lynn didn't have to help us. She could have said thank you and moved on with her life. But she chose to dig deeper, to question a system she was part of. That took courage." He smiled slightly. "Almost as much courage as it took for my son to help a police officer when he had every reason not to." Ander looked down at the baby's photo. "So you think we should do it?" "I think we should consider it. Your mother and I agreed we'd talk to you first. This would involve your story too." The next day, Andrew's birthday celebration was in full swing. Their new apartment was filled with family, friends from school, and neighbors from their building. Even Andrew's grandmother had made the trip from out of state to be there. The doorbell rang during the cake cutting. Andrew's mother answered it to find Lynn, David, and baby Hope standing there with gifts. "I hope we're not intruding," Lynn said hesitantly. "We just wanted to drop these off for Andra." "Nonsense. Come in," Letitia insisted, waving them inside. "We have plenty of cake." Some of the guests, particularly the older ones who remembered the days when seeing a police officer at your door meant trouble, looked uncomfortable when they realized who had arrived. But the Mitchells moved easily through the crowd, David chatting with Michael's co-workers from the hospital, Lynn bouncing Hope on her hip as she talked with Andrew's grandmother. Ander watched with interest as initial wariness gave way to cautious conversation, then to genuine engagement. By the time they sang Happy Birthday, the atmosphere had shifted, the invisible barriers beginning to dissolve. Later, as the party wound down, Lynn pulled Ander aside. "Your dad mentioned he talked to you about Bridge the Gap," she said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I don't want to put any pressure on you. It's completely your choice." Ander nodded, thinking carefully before he responded. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why is this so important to you? You helped my dad already. You could just go back to your regular job." Lynn looked at him thoughtfully. "You know, before I met you, I thought I was a good police officer. I followed procedures, treated people with respect, did everything by the book." She glanced toward the living room, where her husband was showing baby Hope to Andrew's sisters. "But I never questioned the book itself, the system I was part of." She turned back to Andra. "When I looked into your father's case and found what I found, it shook me. Made me wonder how many other mistakes or injustices I might have been part of without realizing it." She lowered her voice slightly. "There are good people in law enforcement, Andra. People who truly want to protect and serve. But there are also flawed procedures, biased assumptions, and sometimes plain old bad actors. The only way things will change is if people on both sides are willing to listen and learn from each other." Ander considered this. "And you think our story could help with that?" "I think it already has," she said, smiling. "Look around." Ander followed her gaze to the living room, where guests who had been strangers hours ago now talked and laughed together. His father was explaining something to one of Lynn's fellow officers who had arrived later, the two men gesturing animatedly, all tension absent from their interaction. "This is what Bridge the Gap could be," Lynn continued. "A chance to see each other as people first, to build understanding before judgment." 2 weeks later, Andrew stood nervously in the community center attached to the local library. The room was set up with chairs in a circle, and people were filtering in. A mix of police officers in civilian clothes, community members, social workers, and a few politicians. His parents sat beside him, his mother squeezing his hand reassuringly. Lynn stood at the front of the room, welcoming people and explaining the purpose of the meeting. "We're here today to begin a conversation," she said. "A conversation about justice, community, and how we can better serve each other." She introduced several speakers: a retired judge, a community organizer, and then, to Andrew's surprise, his father. Michael spoke simply but powerfully about his experience, the arrest, the years in prison, and the unexpected turn of events that led to his freedom. He didn't shy away from the anger and pain he had felt, but he also spoke about forgiveness and second chances. "My son taught me something important," he concluded. "He showed me that compassion isn't just a feeling, it's an action. And sometimes that action can change everything." When it was Andrew's turn to speak, he stood slowly, heart hammering in his chest. Public speaking had never been his thing. But as he looked around the room, he saw encouraging faces, his parents, the Mitchells, and strangers who were giving him their full attention. "I'm not special," he began. "I'm just a kid who did what my parents taught me to do, help someone in trouble. I didn't think about uniforms or badges that day in the park. I just saw someone who needed help." As he continued his story, his nervousness faded. He spoke about his initial fear of police, his surprise at Lynn's offer to help his father, and the friendship that had developed between their families. "I learned that people are more than the jobs they do or the mistakes they've made," he said. "And sometimes one small action can start something much bigger than yourself." When he finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting in applause. Andrew returned to his seat, embarrassed but proud. After the meeting, as people mingled and exchanged contact information, a reporter from the local newspaper approached Andrew and his parents. "Would you be willing to share your story with our readers?" she asked. "I think people across the city could learn from what you've experienced." Andrew looked at his parents, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes," he said. "I think that would be good." As they left the community center, the evening sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink. Lynn walked beside them, baby Hope sleeping against her shoulder. "This is just the beginning," she said softly, "but it's a good beginning." Andrew nodded, looking up at the sky. One moment in a park had led to this. A movement growing from a simple act of kindness, rippling outward to touch more lives than he could have imagined. And somewhere in that ripple effect, he had found not just his father, but his own voice and purpose as well. The newspaper article changed everything. What had started as a small community meeting suddenly gained citywide attention when the story of Andrew, his father Michael, and Officer Lynn Mitchell appeared on the front page of the Sunday edition. The headline read, "A Moment of Kindness: How a Boy's Good Deed Led to Justice and Healing." Andrew felt strange seeing his family's story laid out for everyone to read. The morning after the article was published, his phone buzzed constantly with messages from classmates who had never paid him much attention before. At school the next day, teachers stopped him in the hallway to express their admiration. "It's weird," he told his father that evening. "I didn't do anything special. I just helped someone who needed help." Michael smiled, passing him a plate for dinner. Sometimes the simplest actions are the most powerful, son, especially when they cross boundaries that others are afraid to cross. The article had detailed not only Andrew's rescue of Lynn and her baby, but also Michael's wrongful conviction and eventual exoneration. It explained how Lynn had investigated the case on her own initiative after learning about the connection to Andrew's family. Most importantly, it highlighted the Bridge the Gap program and its mission to rebuild trust between law enforcement and communities that had often felt targeted rather than protected. Within days, Lynn's phone was ringing nonstop. Other police departments wanted information about the program. Community organizations offered partnerships. Local businesses pledged support. Even the mayor called, promising resources and public backing. 2 weeks after the article, Lynn invited the Thompson family to meet her at City Hall. They'd found her in a conference room with the mayor, the police chief, and several community leaders. "There you are," Lynn exclaimed when they entered, baby Hope bouncing on her hip. The little girl was now crawling and trying to stand, growing stronger every day. "I wanted you to hear this directly from all of us." The mayor, a tall woman with quick eyes and a no-nonsense manner, got straight to the point. "We've secured funding to expand Bridge the Gap citywide," she announced. Ms. Mitchell will head the initiative, with support from both the police department and community organizations. Andrew glanced at Lynn, surprised. "You're leaving the police force?" "Not exactly," Lynn explained. "I'm taking a special assignment. Still an officer, but focused on making Bridge the Gap work." She looked around the table. "And I want your family involved, if you're willing. Your story is what made people listen in the first place." Michael looked at Letitia, some unspoken communication passing between them. "What would that look like, exactly?" Letitia asked. The police chief, a veteran officer with graying hair at his temples, leaned forward. "We're establishing a civilian oversight committee for Bridge the Gap. We'd like Michael to serve on it, bring his perspective and experience to the table." Michael's eyebrows rose. "You want someone who was wrongfully imprisoned by your department to help oversee a police initiative?" "That's exactly why we want you," the chief said frankly. "We need voices that will challenge us, hold us accountable. Otherwise, this just becomes a public relations exercise, not real change." A community organizer named Ray, who had been at the first Bridge the Gap meeting, turned to Andra. "And we'd like you to speak at schools, help start youth chapters of the program. Kids often listen better to other kids than to adults." Andra felt a flutter of anxiety at the thought of speaking in front of crowds, but also a spark of excitement. "I could do that," he said, more confidently than he felt. Over the next month, Bridge the Gap transformed from a small community meeting into a structured program with multiple components. Discussion forums where officers and community members could speak openly about tensions and concerns, training for police on recognizing and addressing bias, mentorship programs pairing officers with local youth, and a review board that examined police procedures and practices with input from community representatives. Michael took his role on the oversight committee seriously, attending weekly meetings where he often asked the uncomfortable questions others were hesitant to raise. 3 years behind bars gives you a different perspective, he explained to Andra after one particularly tense session. "I'm not interested in making people comfortable. I'm interested in making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else." Andra, meanwhile, found himself standing before his first audience of students at a middle school across town. His knees shook as he faced 30 curious faces, but once he began telling his story, the moment in the park, the fear and hesitation he'd felt, the decision to help anyway, the words flowed naturally. "I was afraid of police," he admitted to the students. "My dad was in prison. In my neighborhood, we didn't see officers as people who would help us. But that day, I saw past the uniform to the person who needed me. And that one moment changed everything, not just for Officer Mitchell and her baby, but for my whole family." After his presentation, a small group of students lingered to ask questions. One boy, thin and quiet with eyes that reminded Andra of himself a year ago, waited until the others have left. "My older brother got arrested last year," the boy said in a near whisper. "He didn't do what they said, but nobody believes him. Do you think," he hesitated, "do you think what happened for your dad could happen for him too?" Andra felt the weight of the question. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I know people are listening now in ways they weren't before. Can you come to our next youth meeting? Maybe we can find a way to help." The boy nodded, a tiny flicker of hope crossing his face. That night, Andrew couldn't sleep, thinking about the boy and his brother. He slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen for a glass of water, surprised to find his mother already there, nursing a cup of tea. "Can't sleep?" she asked, pulling out a chair for him. Andrew shook his head, telling her about the boy at the school. Letitia listened thoughtfully. "You know, sometimes I still can't believe how much our lives have changed in a year," she said when he finished. "Last October, we were barely getting by. Your father was in prison. We had no hope of things ever improving." She reached out to touch his hand. and then you took a shortcut through the park. I've been thinking about that, Andrew said. About how one small thing led to all this. It's like dropping a stone in water and watching the ripples spread out farther than you can see. His mother smiled. That's a good way to put it. Ripples. The ripples continued to spread. By December, Bridge the Gap had established chapters in 5 school districts. Police officers were participating in community events, not as security but as neighbors and partners. The program had even helped the Quiet Boy's family connect with a legal aid organization to review his brother's case. A week before Christmas, the Thompsons hosted a holiday gathering at their apartment. The small living room was crowded with a mix of people who would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Police officers and their families, community activists, neighbors, and friends from school and work. Lynn arrived with her family, Hope now tumbling unsteadily between adults, grabbing onto legs for support. The baby had no memory of her dramatic arrival into the world or the boy who had helped save her, but her presence was a constant reminder of how their lives had intertwined. As the evening progressed, the police chief arrived unexpectedly, carrying a small wrapped package. He approached Andra, who was helping serve dessert. "I wanted to give you this in person," he said, handing Andra the package. "It's a token of appreciation from the department." Andra unwrapped it carefully, revealing a framed certificate. It read, "Honorary Youth Ambassador for Community Relations," with his name inscribed below. "We're establishing a scholarship program for young people who demonstrate exceptional community service," the chief explained. "It's been named the Andrew Thompson Bridge Builder Scholarship. We'd like you to help select the recipients each year." Andrew stared at the certificate, speechless. His father appeared at his side, reading over his shoulder. "That's quite an honor," Michael said, his voice deliberately neutral as he looked at the chief. The chief nodded. "It's deserved. Your son has taught our department more about community policing than a dozen training manuals ever could." He looked around the room, where officers and community members chatted easily together. A year ago, this gathering would have been unimaginable. Later, as guests began to leave, Andrew found himself standing near the window with Lynn, watching the snow that had just begun to fall. "Did you ever imagine all this would happen?" he asked her. "When I found you in the park that day?" Lynn shook her head, smiling as she watched Hope play with Andrew's youngest sister. "I was just trying to stay conscious, to be honest. I certainly never imagined that moment would lead to," she gestured around the room, "all of this." "Me neither," Andrew admitted. "I just did what felt right." "That's how change happens," Lynn said softly, "not with grand gestures or big plans, but with ordinary people doing what feels right, one moment at a time." Andrew watched the snowflakes swirling outside, thinking about ripples and bridges and unexpected connections. A year ago, his world had been small and limited, defined by what his family didn't have and couldn't do. Now it felt expansive and full of possibility. "You know what's funny," he said. "If you had told me back then that a police officer would change my life, I would have thought you meant in a bad way." Lynn laughed. "And if you had told me a 12-year-old boy would change my life, I probably wouldn't have believed you either." She touched his shoulder lightly. "But here we are." "Here we are," Andrew repeated, watching the snow transform the ordinary street into something magical and new. 5 years passed in what felt like the blink of an eye. Andrew stood at the podium, adjusting his tie nervously as he looked out at the packed auditorium. At 17, he'd grown tall and confident, though public speaking still gave him butterflies. The audience before him was a sea of diverse faces: police officers in dress uniforms, community members, city officials, and dozens of teenagers wearing blue t-shirts with "Bridge the Gap Youth Leadership" printed across the front. 5 years ago, he began, his voice stronger than he felt. "I took a shortcut through West Side Park on my way home from school. I had no idea that simple decision would change not just my life, but the lives of so many others." The annual Bridge the Gap conference had grown each year, from a local gathering to a regional event that now drew participants from 3 states. Police departments and community organizations sent representatives to learn how a program born from one unexpected connection had succeeded where so many others had failed. As Andrew shared updates on the program's accomplishments over the past year, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The scholarship fund named after him had sent 15 students to college so far. The Civilian Oversight Committee that his father helped lead had reviewed and reformed dozens of police procedures. Youth chapters of Bridge the Gap now existed in every middle and high school in the city. But the statistics didn't tell the whole story. The real success was in the changed relationships, the dissolved barriers, the trust slowly being rebuilt between communities and the officers who served them. We've made progress, Andrew concluded, but our work is far from finished. Every day, we need to choose connection over division, understanding over judgment, and most importantly, action over indifference. As he stepped away from the podium, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Andrew caught his father's eye in the front row, Michael nodding with unmistakable pride. Beside him sat Letitia, dabbing at her eyes, and Andrew's sisters, now teenagers themselves and active Bridge the Gap youth leaders. Lynn Mitchell stood next, walking to the podium with the confidence of someone who had found her purpose. At 41, she had recently been promoted to Deputy Chief of Community Relations, a position created specifically to oversee Bridge the Gap and similar initiatives throughout the police department. "Thank you, Andra, for that powerful reminder of why we're here," she said. "Now, I'd like to share some exciting news. The Justice Department has selected our Bridge the Gap program as a national model for police community relations. Starting next month, we'll be working with 10 cities across the country to help them implement similar programs." A murmur of excitement rippled through the audience. "This would never have happened without the Thompson family," Lynn continued, turning toward where they sat. "Their willingness to transform a personal injustice into a force for positive change has been the foundation of everything we've accomplished." After the conference, a small celebration was held at the Thompsons' home, no longer the apartment in River Bend, but a modest house they had purchased 2 years ago. The compensation from Michael's wrongful incarceration case, combined with his steady advancement at the hospital, had finally made homeownership possible. Their backyard was filled with friends and colleagues from Bridge the Gap. 6-year-old Hope Mitchell ran around with other children, her curly hair bouncing as she played. It was hard to believe this energetic little girl was the same tiny baby who had once fought for life in the night Hugh. "So," Lynn said, finding Andra by the snack table, "have you decided which college you're going to?" Andra nodded. "State University. Their pre-med program has that special community health track I wanted." "Dr. Thompson," Lynn tested the title with a smile. "It suits you." "If I make it through all those years of school," Andra laughed. "Dad says I'm crazy to sign up for so much studying." "Your father is proud of you," Lynn assured him. "We all are." Dr. Mitchell joined them, now the head of emergency medicine at the hospital. "Speaking of your father, he just told me the most interesting news. The Housing Authority has approved your community clinic proposal for the East Side neighborhood." Andrew's eyes widened. "Already? We just submitted it last month." The East Side was one of the city's most underserved areas, with limited access to health care and high rates of chronic illness. Andrew had been working with his father and Dr. Mitchell on a proposal for a free clinic that would serve residents who often avoided seeking medical care due to cost or mistrust of institutions. "They fast-tracked it," Dr. Mitchell confirmed. "Your father's reputation with the community made all the difference. They know if Michael Thompson is involved, it's going to be done right." Andrew looked across the yard to where his father stood talking with Ray, the community organizer who had become one of their closest allies. In the 5 years since his release, Michael had transformed from a man trying to rebuild his own life into a respected community leader. His position on the Bridge the Gap Oversight Committee had led to appointments on other city boards and commissions, where his straightforward approach and lived experience brought perspectives that had long been missing. "You know," Lynn said thoughtfully, "when I think about how all this started, with you finding me in that park, it seems almost unbelievable." "I thought about that a lot," Andrew admitted. "What if I'd taken a different route home that day? What if I'd seen your uniform and just kept walking? So many little decisions that could have gone another way." "But they didn't," Dr. Mitchell said firmly. "You made the choice that mattered." Later that evening, as the gathering wound down, Andrew found himself sitting on the front porch steps with the quiet boy from that school presentation 5 years ago. Thomas, no longer quiet or small, but a confident 16-year-old and one of Bridge the Gap's most dedicated youth leaders. My brother's getting out next month, Thomas said, staring at the darkening sky. The Innocence Project finally got his case overturned. Andrew bumped Thomas's shoulder with his own. That's amazing news, man. How long has it been? 6 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Thomas replied immediately. But who's counting? They shared a knowing look. Andrew understood better than most the exact counting of days when someone you loved was locked away. He wants to meet you, Thomas added. I've told him all about Bridge the Gap, about what your family did. He says he wants to help when he gets out, be part of making things better. Andrew nodded. We'll be there for him. The transition isn't easy, my dad would tell you that, but having support makes all the difference. Thomas was quiet for a moment before saying, before I met you, I thought things would never change. That the system was too big, too broken to fix. It still is broken in many ways, Andrew said honestly. We haven't fixed everything, not even close. But we're trying, Thomas insisted. And things are changing, bit by bit. My brother's coming home. 5 years ago, I didn't think that would ever happen. As the last guests departed and the Thompson family began cleaning up, Andrew's mother found him washing dishes in the kitchen. You were wonderful today, she said, drying a plate he handed her. Your speech at the conference, the way you talked with everyone afterward. I kept thinking about that 12-year-old boy who was too shy to order his own food at restaurants. Andrew laughed. I still get nervous, Mom. My hands were shaking the whole time I was at the podium. But you did it anyway, she said proudly. That's courage. His father walked in, carrying a stack of empty serving trays. Just got a text from the mayor. She wants us at City Hall next week. Something about a statewide expansion of the program. Andrew shook his head in amazement. Remember when this was just a small meeting at the community center? Michael set down the trays and put an arm around each of them. From one moment in a park to changing policies across the state. Not bad for a family that was barely holding it together 5 years ago. Later that night, Andrew stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street. His walls were now covered with college acceptance letters, awards from Bridge the Gap, and photos of the many people whose lives had become intertwined with his family's journey. In the center, in a simple frame, was the newspaper article that had started it all, the story of a boy who helped a pregnant police officer and the remarkable chain of events that followed. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the headline still stood out clearly, A Moment of Kindness, how a boy's good deed led to justice and healing. Andrew touched the frame gently. Sometimes it still felt surreal, how one decision had expanded his world in ways he could never have imagined. From a family struggling to survive to community leaders helping shape policy. From fearing police to working alongside them to create change. From a boy taking a shortcut through a park to a young man preparing to become a doctor who would serve the community that raised him. The journey wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done, so many systems that needed to change, so many bridges yet to be built. But standing in his room, surrounded by the evidence of what was possible when people chose connection over division, Andrew felt something that had once seemed out of reach for his family. Hope for the future, not just for themselves, but for their community and beyond. All because he had stopped to help someone in need. All because Officer Lynn Mitchell had looked beyond her gratitude to see an injustice that needed correcting. All because his father had chosen reconciliation over bitterness. All because they had all, in their own ways, decided that change begins with individual choices and actions, one human connection at a time. Outside his window, a new day was dawning, full of possibilities yet to be discovered and bridges yet to be built. Andrew was ready for whatever came next.